Gather round the fire, friends, and listen. Out here on the frontier, a man's story is often measured by the weight of the gun on his hip. But the tale I'm spinning for you tonight is about a man whose story was measured by the lack of weight. A man who carried more ghosts than bullets. It's a tale of revenge, as cold and straight as a rifle barrel, set in a land where the sun can burn the soul right out of you. The sun that beat down on the town of Border Ridge was a merciless, white-hot thing. It leached the color from the sky, the wood of the buildings, and the hopes of the men who lived there. The town was a collection of heat-warped, sun-bleached planks huddled against the vast and forgiving emptiness of the Arizona-Mexico borderlands, a place where the world seemed to run out of ideas. Dust, as fine and pale as bone ash, coated every surface, stirred only by the listless, hot breeze that blew up from the south, carrying with it the scent of desolation and the promise of nothing. It was into this suffocating stillness that the writer appeared. He came from the east, a lone, dark figure materializing out of the shimmering heat haze. He rode not with the urgency of a man on a mission, nor the swagger of an outlaw, but with the slow, inexorable patience of a glacier. He was a part of the heat and the dust, a specter given form. His horse was a lean, weary buckskin, a creature as tough and anonymous as the landscape. It was the man himself who was a dissonance, a note of cold, hard purpose in a symphony of decay. He wore a dark, travel-stained duster and a low-brimmed hat that kept his face in perpetual shadow. He was tall, but gaunt, as if he'd been stripped down to nothing but bone, sinew, and will. As he rode down the center of the town's only street, a few faces peered from behind grimy windows, their expressions dull and incurious, before turning away. Strangers were not a welcome sight in Border Ridge, but they were not an uncommon one either. This was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better, or somewhere worse. He dismounted in front of the livery stable, his movements economical and devoid of any wasted energy. The stable owner, a stooped, one-eyed man named Jeb, came out, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "Room for the horse. A rub down and water," the stranger said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, like stones being ground together at the bottom of a dry well. It was a voice that hadn't been used for pleasantries in a long, long time. Jeb nodded, his single eye taking in the stranger, the dust-caked clothes, and lingering for a moment on the gun belt. It was a strange rig. The leather was old and worn, but well cared for. The holster held a cold peacemaker, its wooden grips worn smooth with use. But the belt itself, it was the cartridge loops that were odd. They were almost all empty. Jeb's practiced eye counted them. 3. Only 3 brass-case cartridges gleamed dully in the afternoon sun. The rest of the loops were vacant, mocking gaps in the leather. It made the gun belt look imbalanced, incomplete, like a man who had lost most of his teeth. "Just 3, huh?" Jeb grunted, unable to stop himself. "Travelin' light, or just real confident?" The stranger's head lifted slightly, and for a moment, Jeb could see his eyes from under the shadow of his hat. They were the color of a faded blue sky, but they held a chilling emptiness, a profound and bottomless grief that made the stableman take an involuntary step back. "Confident," the stranger said, the single word carrying no boast, only a flat, cold statement of fact. He tossed Jeb a coin, turned, and walked away, his spurs ringing a lonely, rhythmic dirge on the dusty street. The man's name was Elias Marlowe. Once, he had been known in every saloon and gambling den from the Rockies to the Sierra Nevadas. Men had called him the Serpent, for his speed and his cold-blooded efficiency. He had been a gun for hire, a man who rented out his lethal skill to the highest bidder, his only loyalty to the coin. He had been amoral, detached, a professional in the business of violence. He had a younger brother, Ethan, who was the opposite worm, quick to laugh, and full of a foolish belief in honor among thieves. Ethan had been Elias's only anchor to the world of men, the only person who could draw a genuine smile from his face. And Ethan was dead. Now, Elias had a new name, one whispered only by the few who had seen his work over the last year. They called him Elias 3 Shots Marlowe, a ghost who had surfaced in a dusty Texas town to put a bullet through the heart of a cattle baron named Silas Croft. A phantom who had materialized in a smoky San Francisco gambling den to end the life of a cheat known as Lefty Pete. To men, to bullets, his work had been as clean and final as a surgeon's cut. Now, he was in Border Ridge, Arizona. And in the cylinder of his Colt, Nestled amongst 3 empty chambers was the third and final bullet. On that bullet was inscribed, in his mind's eye, the third and final name, Alistair Finch. The man who had been the brains of the operation. The man who had given the order. The man who was now the respectable, founding father mayor of this god-forsaken town. Elias walked the length of the street, his senses absorbing everything. The town was small, easily contained. A single saloon, a mercantile, a church with a cracked bell, a bank, and at the far end, a 2-story adobe building that served as the mayor's office and the town hall. A freshly painted sign hung above its door, Alistair Finch Mayor. Progress and prosperity. The lie was so blatant it was almost admirable. He pushed through the batwing doors of the saloon. It was dark and smelled of spilled tequila and desperation. A few miners were playing a listless game of cards. A lone cowboy stared into a shot glass as if searching for answers at the bottom. Elias walked to the bar, choosing a spot at the far end, where his back would be to the wall and he could see the entire room, including the door. It was a habit as ingrained as breathing. "Whiskey," he said to the bartender. The bartender, a man with a nervous tick in his eye, slid a glass and a bottle toward him. As Elias poured, he felt a gaze on him. He didn't turn. He watched in the grimy back bar mirror. A man wearing a deputy's star was watching him from a table in the corner. He was young, with an arrogant swagger and a hand that rested a little too casually on the butt of his pistol. Elias took a slow sip of the whiskey. It was cheap and burned all the way down. He let the fire settle in his gut. He was a patient man. He had been patient for 3 years. The years of drifting, of healing from the wounds of the betrayal, of gathering the whispers and rumors that had finally led him on his 3-bullet quest. He could wait a little longer. He was a ghost with a purpose. He was an ending walking onto legs. And he had come to Border Ridge to deliver his third and final sermon from the barrel of a gun. The town didn't know it yet, but it was about to become the final battlefield in a war that had started long ago, in a bloody canyon over a pile of stolen gold. And in his holster, Elias Marlowe carried not just a gun, but a final judgment, waiting to be passed. Alistair Finch was a man who had meticulously constructed his own reality. He had built the town of Border Ridge not with wood and nails, but with his own formidable will and a steady supply of stolen gold. To the townspeople, he was a savior, the visionary who had arrived 5 years ago and transformed a collection of dusty shacks into a proper town with a bank, a charter, and the promise of a future. He was handsome in a severe, well-maintained way, with silvering hair at his temples and eyes the color of polished slate. He dressed in tailored suits that seemed impervious to the dust and heat, a walking effigy of progress and respectability. He spoke of bringing the railroad south, of investment, of prosperity. He was the sun around which the small, desperate planet of Border Ridge revolved. But this reality was a fortress, and behind its walls, Alistair Finch was a prisoner of his own past. He was a man who slept with a derringer under his pillow and never sat with his back to a door. His benevolence was a performance, his promises a misdirection. The town's prosperity was his prosperity, the bank was his bank, the mercantile was his mercantile, and the law was his law. His past was a bloody canyon, a dying boy's last gasp, and a fortune in gold bars that he had laundered into legitimacy. He had 2 partners in that crime. Silas Croft, the muscle, was now 6 feet under the Texas dirt, shot dead in a supposed dispute over cattle rights. Lefty Pete, the inside man, had been found floating in the San Francisco Bay, his pockets full of stones, a victim of the city's notorious criminal element. Finch had read the news of their deaths with a cool, detached satisfaction. The loose ends were being tied up, almost as if by an act of God. But Finch did not believe in God. He believed in men, and he knew that men could hold a grudge longer and more tenaciously than any deity. He was in his office, a spacious, wood-paneled room on the 2nd floor of the town hall, when his deputy, Caleb Shaw, walked in. Shaw was the physical embodiment of Finch's authority, young, strong, arrogant, and loyal not to the law, but to the man who paid his wages. "Mayor," Shaw said, his posture a little too relaxed, a little too familiar. "There's a new man in town. Rode in an hour ago." Finch didn't look up from the SE report he was studying. "Border Ridge gets drifters every day, Caleb. Are we now making a federal case of each one?" "This one's different," Shaw said, leaning against the doorframe. "Quiet. Real quiet. Sits in the saloon like he's waiting for someone. And he's got a strange rig. Gun belt's almost empty. Carries just 3 rounds. Finch's hand, which was holding a fountain pen, stopped moving. 3 rounds. The detail was so specific, so odd, that it snagged in his mind like a fishhook. He thought of Croft. The report from his contacts in Texas had been specific. He'd been killed by a single, perfectly placed bullet. He thought of Lefty Pete. The papers had called it a gangland killing, but a private investigator Finch had hired had found a witness, a frightened prostitute, who said Pete had been confronted by a single, quiet man just before he disappeared. To men. To bullets. A cold, serpentine dread began to uncoil in the pit of Finch's stomach. He slowly placed his pen down, creating a small, perfect ink blot on the report. He looked up at Shaw, his slate gray eyes suddenly sharp and focused. Describe him. Tall, lean. Looks like he's been through a grinder, Shaw reported. Wears a dark duster, hat pulled low. Can't really see his face. But he's got this look about him like a wolf that's been starving for a long, long time. Finch felt the blood drain from his face. He stood up and walked to the window, which overlooked the main street. He could see the livery, the saloon, the entire dusty stage of his constructed reality. For 5 years, he had been the director, the lead actor, the god of this small world. Now, an uninvited character had walked onto his stage, a ghost from a play he thought had long since ended. Find out who he is, Finch ordered, his voice a low, strained whisper. Find out his name, his business. I want to know where he sleeps, what he eats, who he talks to. But be careful, Caleb. Do not confront him directly. This man, if he is who I think he is not some common saddle tramp. You think you know him? Shaw asked, his arrogance replaced by a flicker of genuine curiosity. Finch did not answer. He was staring down at the street, his mind racing back 5 years, to a bloody canyon floor. He remembered a man, a peerless gunfighter known as the Serpent, who had a younger brother he doted on. A younger brother who had been a liability. He remembered the gunshots, the pleas, and the final, chilling promise from the Serpent, who lay bleeding in the dust, his eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it was almost holy. I will find you. All 3 of you. Just do as I say, Finch said, turning from the window, his face a pale, rigid mask. This is a shadow, Caleb. A shadow from a long way off. And I want to know if it has come here to fall on us. Shaw, sensing the palpable fear in a man he had never seen show any emotion other than cold control, felt a shiver run down his own spine. Yes, sir, Mayor, he said, his voice now respectful, and he slipped out of the room. Alistair Finch stood alone in his office, the silence suddenly oppressive. The fortress of his new life, which had seemed so solid, so permanent, now felt as fragile as glass. He walked to a heavy oak cabinet and poured himself a brandy, his hand shaking almost imperceptibly. He had killed 2 partners to consolidate his power and his wealth. But there had been a third partner in that initial crime, a man whose skill had made the whole thing possible. A man he had left for dead. A man who had a reason to hold a grudge. He looked at his reflection in the window pane. He saw the respectable mayor, the man of vision. But behind that reflection, he saw a younger man standing over a dead boy, and he heard the echo of a promise. The shadow was here, and Finch knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it had a name. And that name was Elias Marlowe. Elias took a room not at the main boarding house, where questions would be asked and eyes would be watchful, but in a small, sparsely furnished room above the livery stable. The arrangement suited him. The smell of hay and horse was honest, and the solitude was a familiar cloak. His window overlooked the main street, offering a perfect vantage point of the mayor's office. He paid the one-eyed Jeb for a week in cash, his taciturn nature discouraging any further attempts at conversation. In the sterile anonymity of that room, with the dying afternoon light painting long shadows on the floor, Elias finally allowed the past to claim him. Revenge, he had learned, was a patient hunter, but it fed on memory. To keep the fire of his purpose burning, he had to tend to the ghosts. He sat on the edge of the narrow cot, and buckled his gun belt, and held the heavy cold peacemaker in his hands. He didn't clean it. He just held it, the worn wooden grips of familiar, cold comfort. He closed his eyes, and the dusty, quiet town of Border Ridge dissolved, replaced by the sharp, pine-scented air of the Colorado high country. 5 years ago. Flashback. Elias and Ethan Marlowe were two sides of the same tarnished coin. Elias, older by 7 years, was the cynic, the professional. He had been shaped by a harsh world that paid for speed and ruthlessness. His heart was a fortress, and Ethan was the only one he had ever allowed inside its walls. Ethan was his opposite, a young man of 22 with a quick, easy smile and a belief in a code of honor that Elias knew was a fairy tale. Ethan saw their life as a grand adventure, a path to a respectable future where they could buy a ranch and leave the gun-for-hire business behind. Elias saw it as a dirty job, a means to an end, and his only goal was to keep his brother safe from the wolves he willingly ran with. Their latest employer was Alistair Finch, a man who dressed like a banker and had the soul of a snake. He was charismatic and intelligent, a planner. With him were the other two pieces of the puzzle, Silas Croft, a hulking, brutish man whose only skill was violence, and Lefty Pete, a weaselly railroad telegraph operator who provided the inside information. The job was their biggest yet, an army payroll shipment, a half-ton of freshly minted gold bars being transported by a special train through a remote canyon. The heist itself was a masterpiece of planning and execution, all orchestrated by Finch. Lefty Pete provided the train schedule and the exact location of the gold car. Elias and Ethan, using their knowledge of the terrain, set a dynamite charge on the tracks at a narrow pass, derailing the engine. Silas and his hired muscle took out the dozen payroll guards in a brutal, efficient firefight. It was bloody, but it was flawless. They hauled the heavy gold bars from the wrecked train car, stacking them like firewood in the back of a sturdy wagon. The adrenaline of the fight and the sheer, staggering weight of their success created a giddy, euphoric atmosphere. Ethan, his face smudged with soot, was laughing, clapping Silas on the back. "We did it," he shouted, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the canyon. "Enough here to start over a dozen times. We're finally done, Eli." Elias didn't share his brother's elation. He watched Finch, who was not celebrating. Finch was observing the scene with a cold, appraising look, his eyes like those of a chess master calculating the final moves of a game. Elias felt a familiar, cold prickle of unease on the back of his neck. Something was wrong. "Let's get this loaded and get out of here," Elias said, his voice cutting through the celebration. As they were lifting the last of the gold, Finch called a meeting. "A toast," he said, producing a bottle of expensive whiskey. "To a job well done." He poured for shots. He, Silas, and Lefty Pete took theirs. He offered the last to Ethan. Elias, who never drank on a job, shook his head. "Ethan, no," he said, a quiet warning. But Ethan, caught up in the moment, just grinned at his ever-cautious brother. "One drink won't hurt, Eli. We're rich." He took the glass and drank it down. The effect was almost instantaneous. Ethan's eyes went wide, a look of confusion on his face. He swayed, his hand going to his throat as if he couldn't breathe. He dropped the glass and staggered, his legs buckling. What did you?" Ethan gasped, looking at Finch. "You're a loose end, kid," Finch said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You talk too much. You dream too much. This is a business, not an adventure." The world seemed to slow down. Elias saw the scene with a horrifying clarity, his brother collapsing, the triumphant sneer on Silas Croft's face, the terrified, guilty look in Lefty Pete's eyes. He went for his gun, his hand a blur of motion born from 1,000 life-or-death situations. He was fast, but he was one man against a dozen. Before his gun could clear leather, a shout boomed from behind him. A searing pain exploded in his shoulder, spinning him around. He saw one of Silas's men, his gun smoking. Elias, his arm now useless, tried to switch hands, but it was too late. Silas Croft was on him, his massive form blotting out the sky. A rifle butt crashed into the side of his head, and the world dissolved into a cacophony of pain and roaring darkness. He drifted in and out of consciousness. He was aware of being dragged, of the sharp rocks scraping his back. He heard his brother's weak, desperate cries. He was thrown into a shallow ravine at the edge of the canyon. He heard Finch's voice, cold and distant. "Make sure they're dead. No witnesses." He felt a boot roll him over. He looked up into the cruel, piggish eyes of Silas Croft. Beside him, Ethan lay, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "Please, Ethan whispered. Don't. Silas just laughed. He raised his pistol, aimed it at Ethan's heart, and fired. The sound of the shot was the sound of Elias's world ending. Silas then turned the gun on Elias. Your turn, serpent. He fired again. The bullet tore through Elias's gut and knew blinding agony. He heard them laughing as they walked away, leaving him and his brother for the vultures. He lay there, bleeding, listening to the sound of the wagon creaking away with the gold, with his life. He crawled to his brother. He held Ethan's hand as the last bit of life faded from his eyes. And in that silent, bloody canyon, lying next to the one person he had ever truly loved, Elias Marlowe made a promise. He didn't know how, and he didn't know when, but he would survive, and he would hunt them down. All three of them. One for every man who had orchestrated this betrayal. He would trade his soul for their lives. And flashback. Elias opened his eyes. The room above the livery was dark now, the sun having set. His hand was gripping the butt of his Colt so tightly his knuckles were white. The ghosts were fed. The fire was stoked. He could feel the bullet wound in his side ache with a phantom pain, a permanent reminder. He could still see his brother's face. He rose and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of the town. He saw Deputy Shaw emerge from the saloon and walk briskly toward the mayor's office. Finch was scared. He was sending his dogs to sniff the air. Let them. Elias was not a wolf to be hunted by dogs. He was a ghost, and he had come to Border Ridge not to fight, but to haunt. The fear Alistair Finch was feeling now was just the beginning. Before this was over, Elias would make him remember the true meaning of the word. The next few days in Border Ridge were a masterclass in psychological warfare, a silent, deadly chess match played on the dusty streets. Elias Marlowe did not make a grand challenge. He did not seek a confrontation. Instead, he became a constant, unnerving presence, a living memento mori for Alistair Finch. He would sit for hours on a bench across from the mayor's office, not overtly staring, but simply being there, a dark, motionless figure that drew the eye and chilled the soul. He would walk the town at dawn and at dusk, his steps slow and measured, his path always taking him past Finch's fine, two-story home at the edge of town. He never spoke, he never threatened, but his presence was a louder and more potent threat than any shouted words. The townspeople began to notice. They saw the stranger, with his 3 lonely bullets, and they saw their mayor, who was beginning to show the first visible cracks in his polished facade. Finch's confident stride became a hurried scuttle. He stopped taking his morning constitutional on the boardwalk. He began to travel with 2 hired guards, rough-looking men who flanked him like gargoyles, their hands always near their guns. This display of fear did not reassure the town, it unsettled them. They began to wonder what their prosperous mayor could possibly be so afraid of. The whispers started in the saloon, quiet at first, then growing in volume and speculation. Who was this stranger? What was his business with the mayor? Finch, for his part, was being driven to distraction. Elias's silence was a far more potent weapon than a direct threat. It was a canvas onto which Finch painted his own worst fears. Every night, his sleep was plagued by nightmares of a bloody canyon and a dying boy's eyes. He drank more, his temper growing shorter. He snapped at his deputy, Caleb Shaw, for failing to find any information on the stranger. He doesn't talk to anyone, Shaw reported, his frustration evident. He buys a loaf of bread, a tin of beans, and goes back to his room. He sits. He walks. That's it. He's a ghost. Ghosts don't cast shadows, Caleb Finch roared, slamming his fist on his desk. He's a man. Find a weakness. Everyone has one. Finch decided to force the stranger's hand. He instructed Shaw to begin a campaign of harassment. It was a petty, brutish strategy, born of desperation. The first attempt came in the saloon. Shaw, flanked by 2 of Finch's hired guns, cornered Elias at the bar. "This is a respectable town," stranger Shaw said, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "We don't take kindly to vagrants and loiterers. I think it's time you moved on." Elias turned his head slowly, his faded blue eyes fixing on the deputy. He didn't look angry. He didn't look scared. He looked profoundly weary, as if he were dealing with a buzzing fly. "I'm not loitering, deputy," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I'm enjoying a whiskey. And I paid for my room for the week. Last I checked, that was legal." "I can make it illegal," Shaw sneered, resting his hand on his pistol. "I am the law here." "No," Elias said, his gaze unwavering. "You're a mouthpiece. The law is the man who signs your paychecks." He turned back to his drink, a clear, contemptuous dismissal. The insult was so direct, so public, that Shaw was momentarily stunned into inaction. He flushed a deep red, his hand tightening on his gun. The saloon went dead quiet. But Shaw, for all his bluster, was not a fool. He had seen the stories in the stranger's eyes, and he knew a direct confrontation would be suicide. He backed down, sputtering a weak threat about keeping an eye on him, and retreated from the saloon, the sound of the patrons' barely suppressed snickers following him out the door. Finch's next move was to try and find a different kind of leverage. He had Shaw and his men ransack Elias's room at the livery while he was out. They tore the place apart, ripping open the thin mattress, searching for a clue, a letter, anything that would give them an identity or a weakness. They found nothing. Elias Marlowe traveled with no possessions, save for the clothes on his back, a spare shirt, and a razor. He was a man who had shed his past like a skin, leaving nothing behind but his purpose. The only thing they found of any interest was a small, worn leather pouch. Inside, there was no money, no memento. There was only a single, tarnished silver locket. Shaw pried it open. Inside, on one side, was a faded tintype of a young, smiling man who bore a faint resemblance to the stranger. On the other side was a simple, loving inscription, "To my brother Ethan, always your protector, Elias." When Shaw presented the locket to Finch, the mayor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. It was him. This was not a ghost. This was a brother. And a brother's vengeance was a force of nature. Finch realized his petty games of harassment were pointless. This would not be won with intimidation or legal maneuvering. This would end the way it began, with a gun. The serpent had been playing with him, tightening his coils slowly. Now, Finch knew, he would have to find a way to make the serpent strike on his terms, before it strangled him completely. In a town as tightly controlled as Border Ridge, not all eyes were blind. Sarah is the local schoolteacher, a widow whose husband, the previous sheriff, died under mysterious circumstances a year after Finch's arrival. She is a pillar of quiet integrity in the community, respected and largely left alone by Finch, who sees her as no threat. But Sarah is a keen observer. She knew her husband was an honest man who had started to ask questions about the mayor's finances and the source of his wealth just before his unfortunate riding accident. She has lived under a cloud of suspicion and fear ever since. Her grief hardened into a quiet, watchful resolve. She sees the silent war being waged between the stranger and the mayor, and she recognizes in Elias's cold purpose a reflection of her own unanswered questions. She notices that he never eats at the saloon, but buys his own meager supplies. One evening, driven by an impulse she doesn't fully understand, she approaches him as he leaves the mercantile. "Mister," she says, her voice steady, though her heart is pounding. "You look like a man who could use a home-cooked meal." Elias stops, turning to face her. In the soft light of dusk, his face looks less like a mask of vengeance and more like a landscape of profound sorrow. He is wary, his eyes guarded. "I'm not looking for company, ma'am. And I'm not offering it," she replies, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm offering a square meal and a quiet table. My husband, he used to say a man thinks clearer on a full stomach. And you look like a man with a great deal on his mind." She gestures to her small adobe house next to the school. "No questions asked. Just beef stew." Against his better judgment, Elias accepts. The quiet domesticity of Sarah's home is an alien world to him. It is clean, smells of baked bread and wood smoke, and is filled with books. Over a simple, nourishing meal, they sit in a silence that is not awkward, but companionable. Sarah does not pry. Instead, she talks about the town, about the children she teaches, about the hope that Finch initially brought and the subtle, creeping fear that followed. "This town is a pretty lie, mister," she trails off. "Marlowe," he supplies, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "Mr. Marlowe," she continues. "It's a beautiful facade, but the foundation is rotten. My husband, Tom, he saw it. He started digging. He believed the money that built this town wasn't earned. It was taken." Elias listens, his expression unreadable, but a new, unforeseen variable is entering his cold equation. He came to this town for a singular, selfish purpose. He did not care about Border Ridge or its people. They were simply the backdrop for his final act. But in Sarah's quiet dignity and her veiled story of loss, he hears an echo of his own. He sees that Finch's evil was not a single act in a remote canyon. It was a continuing infection, a poison that had seeped into the very soil of this place. As he prepares to leave, Sarah stops him at the door. "My husband kept a journal," she says, her voice barely a whisper. "He was a meticulous man. He wrote down everything he found. Names, dates, telegraph transfers from a bank in San Francisco that didn't add up. After he died, Mayor Finch came to my house, offering his condolences. And he searched the place. He said he was looking for Tom's official records. I know he was looking for that journal. I had already hidden it." She looks at him, her eyes searching his. "I don't know what your business is with the mayor, Mr. Marlowe, but I believe we might be fighting the same war. Tom's journal. It might be the ammunition you need. Not the kind you carry on your belt, but the kind that can tear down a man's fortress of lies." Elias stands on her porch, the quiet offer hanging in the cool night air. He came to this town to be an end, to put a bullet in a man and close a chapter of his life. But now, an unexpected path has opened. The journal represents a different kind of justice, a justice for the town, for Sarah, for her dead husband. It complicates his simple, bloody mission. For the first time in 3 years, Elias Marlowe is faced with a choice that goes beyond the pull of a trigger. His personal vendetta has just become something much larger. The revelation of the journal forces Elias to reevaluate his entire strategy. His plan had been simple: force a final, public confrontation with Finch, execute his justice with the third bullet, and then simply cease to be, either by a lawman's bullet or by fading into the desert. But Sarah's journal offers the possibility of a different kind of ending, gone that not only satisfies his own need for vengeance but also cleanses the town Finch has poisoned. It is a justice for Ethan, and for Sarah's husband, Tom. He agrees to her proposal. The exchange is to happen the following night, during the town's small Founders' Day celebration, an event Finch himself orchestrated to cement his own legend. The noise and distraction of the festivities will provide the perfect cover. Finch, however, is growing more desperate. Elias's refusal to be provoked, coupled with the town's growing whispers, has pushed him to the edge. He knows he cannot allow this silent ghost to dictate the terms of their conflict any longer. He has to end it, now. He abandons all pretense of subtlety. He summons Caleb Shaw and the 2 hired guns he has brought in, rough men named Harker and Cole. He won't be drawn out, Finch says, his voice a low, vicious snarl. "So, we're going to burn him out. Tonight. I don't care how you do it. Make it look like a drunken accident. A lamp overturned in the livery. I want him dead. I want his body pulled from the ashes." End of story. That evening, as the sun bleeds across the horizon, the town gathers in the small plaza for the Founders' Day celebration. A fiddler plays a cheerful tune that sounds tinny and false in the tense atmosphere. Finch is on the balcony of his office, preparing to give a speech, a grotesque parody of a beloved leader. Sarah, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, slips away from the crowd and heads toward her house, where she will retrieve the journal for Elias. Elias, from his room above the livery, watches the celebration. He is not focused on the music or the people. He is watching Finch. He is waiting for the moment to move. But his instincts, honed by years of survival, scream that something is wrong. The air is too still. He notices Caleb Shaw and the 2 hired guns are not in the plaza. They are conspicuously absent. He glances down into the livery stable below his room. Through the floorboards, he sees a flicker of light that shouldn't be there. He moves to the window that overlooks the back of the stable and sees them. Shaw, Harker, and Cole, spilling kerosene onto the dry hay bales at the foundation of the stable. The trap is not for him to walk into, it's one he is already in. He doesn't hesitate. There is no time to grab possessions he doesn't have. He straps on his gun belt, the weight of the 3 bullets a heavy, final reality. He slips out of his room and down the stable's rear ladder just as Harker throws a lit match onto the kerosene-soaked hay. The flames erupt with a hungry, explosive whoosh. The old, dry timber of the stable catches instantly. As shouts of fire begin to rise from the plaza, Elias melts into the shadows of the back alley. He sees the 3 men watching the blaze, their faces lit with triumphant, hellish light, confident their job is done. They are wrong. A dark figure emerges from the alley behind them. "You're looking for me," Elias says, his voice a cold whisper in the growing chaos. They spin around, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. They see the man they thought was burning alive standing before them, a specter silhouetted against the flames of his own funeral pyre. They go for their guns. They are fast, but they are not the serpent. The alley is filled with a deafening, rolling thunder. Elias fires twice. Not 3 times. 2. His movements are a blur of perfect, lethal economy. The first bullet takes Harker in the chest, the second catches Cole in the throat. They fall without a sound, to puppets whose strings have been cut. Caleb Shaw stands frozen, his pistol half drawn, his face a mask of pure terror. He stares at his 2 dead companions, then at the smoking gun in Elias's hand. He is utterly outmatched and he knows it. He drops his gun, his hands shooting up into the air. Elias walks toward him, the heat from the burning stable at his back. He stops, his gun leveled at the trembling deputy. The firelight dances in his cold, empty eyes. He has used 2 of his 3 bullets. He has broken his own sacred vow. 1 bullet was meant for Croft, 1 for Lefty Pete, 1 for Finch. Now, 2 lives have been spent on mere pawns. He looks at the terrified deputy, then at the burning stable, and then toward the plaza where Alistair Finch is watching the chaos unfold from his balcony. The game has changed. His cold, clean equation of revenge has been bloodied and complicated. Now, he has only 1 bullet left. And 1 name. The fire acts as a terrifying punctuation mark to the Founders' Day celebration. The cheerful fiddle music is replaced by the roar of the flames and the panicked shouts of the townspeople. A bucket brigade is hastily, uselessly formed, their efforts like trying to spit out a forest fire. The livery stable, a tinderbox of drywood and hay, is a lost cause, its flames lighting up the night sky and painting the faces of the onlookers in demonic shades of red and orange. From his balcony, Alistair Finch watches the inferno with a cold, calculating gaze. His plan has gone disastrously wrong. The fire was meant to be a neat, tidy solution, the cremation of a ghost. Instead, it has become a chaotic spectacle, and worse, the ghost has refused to burn. He saw the flashes from the alley, heard the 2 gunshots that were distinct from the crackle of the flames. He knows Shaw, Harker, and Cole are dead. He knows Elias Marlowe is still out there, in the chaos, and is now armed with the righteous fury of a man who has just survived his own murder. The serpent has not just been provoked, it has been cornered. Finch knows it will strike. He retreats into his office, his mind racing. The facade of the respectable mayor is gone, burned away by the livery fire. This is no longer a game of intimidation, it's a battle for survival. He barks orders at the 2 guards he has left, positioning them at the top of the stairs leading to his office. He bars the heavy oak door and stands by the window, his own pistol in his hand, peering into the smoke-filled pandemonium below. Meanwhile, Elias slips through the chaos like a wraith. The fire and the panicked crowd provide the perfect cover. His face is a grim, emotionless mask, but beneath the surface, his mind is a maelstrom. He has broken his own solemn rule. 2 bullets, wasted on hired muscle. The cold purity of his quest has been tainted, sullied by the messy reality of Finch's desperate machinations. The clean, symbolic justice he had envisioned on bullet, 1 name is now impossible. He is left with a single cartridge. 1 shot to resolve a debt that now feels heavier than ever. He makes his way towards Sarah's house. The fire, the gunshot knows she will be terrified, and he feels a flicker of an emotion he hasn't felt in years, responsibility. He finds her on her porch, her face pale, clutching a heavy, leather-bound book to her chest journal. "Mr. Marlowe, I heard shots," she says, her voice trembling. "Finch tried to kill me," he says, his voice flat, devoid of drama. "His men are dead." The finality in his words chills her. She looks from his hard face to the inferno consuming the center of her town. The war she had suspected was being fought in the shadows has now erupted into the open. "What are you going to do?" she asks. "I'm going to finish it," he says. He looks at the journal in her hands. "That book, it's the town's justice. My justice is something else." "It doesn't have to be," she pleads, seeing the abyss in his eyes. "The law can handle him. With this journal, his whole empire will crumble. You don't have to die with him." "The law didn't die with my brother in that canyon, ma'am," he replies, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "I did." He takes the journal from her hands, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Keep your doors locked. Don't come out until it's over." He turns and melts back into the chaos, leaving her on the porch, clutching her shawl. He has the town's justice in one hand, and his own and the gun on his hip. He makes his way not to the front of the mayor's office, but around the back, to the alley that runs behind it. He knows the front is a trap, a killing floor. Like any good predator, he will seek an alternative path to his prey. The fire has cast the town into a state of anarchy. Finch's authority has vanished, replaced by the primal fear of the flames. No one notices the lone, dark figure who scales a trellis onto the roof of the mercantile next to the town hall. He moves across the roofline with a silent, deadly grace, the journal now tucked securely inside his duster. The fire rages, the town screams, and on the rooftop, a ghost with a single bullet prepares for his final confrontation, high above the world of burning chaos that Alastair Finch has created. The roof of the town hall is an island of relative quiet above the pandemonium. The heat from the burning livery washes over Elias in waves, and the air is thick with the smell of pine smoke and ash. From his vantage point, he can see the entire tableau of chaos, the townspeople in a disorganized line, passing useless buckets of water, the horses from the stable, freed by some brave soul, galloping in terror through the streets, and the 2 guards Finch has stationed inside the second-floor windows of his office, their rifle barrels glinting in the firelight. Elias knows a direct assault through the window is too risky. He is one man, with 1 bullet. He needs to control the encounter, to face Finch on his own terms. He moves to the back of the roof and finds what he was hoping for, a small attic window, likely forgotten and unsecured. The old wood protests with a groan as he pries it open and slips inside. The attic is a cramped, stifling space filled with old records, forgotten furniture, and the dust of years, all of it illuminated by the hellish red glow from the fire outside. He moves without a sound, his boots silent on the dusty floorboards. He finds the hatch that leads to the second-floor hallway and listens. He can hear the nervous shuffling of the 2 guards just outside the mayor's office door. He doesn't use the hatch. Instead, he uses the butt of his pistol to silently knock a small hole in the brittle plaster of the ceiling, just to the side of the guards. Peering through, he can see them perfectly, their backs to him, their attention focused entirely on the staircase. What happens next is a testament to his ruthless pragmatism. He doesn't engage them in a gunfight. He drops a heavy, dust-covered chair from the attic directly onto the head of the nearest guard. The man collapses without a sound. The second guard spins around, his rifle coming up, his face a mask of confusion. Before he can process what's happening, Elias drops from the attic, landing in a crouch behind him. He strikes the man at the base of the skull with the barrel of his Colt, a single, economical blow that sends him slumping to the floor. He has neutralized the guards without firing his final, precious shot. He stands before the heavy oak door of the mayor's office. He can feel Finch's presence on the other side, a palpable aura of fear and caged hatred. "It's over, Finch," Elias says, his voice a low, calm statement that carries easily through the wood. A shot explodes from inside the office, the bullet splintering the door just inches from Elias's head. "You'll have to come in and get me, Marlowe," Finch screams, his voice high and strained, stripped of its cultivated composure. Elias doesn't answer. He doesn't try to kick the door in. He simply waits. The silence stretches, broken only by the roar of the fire outside and the ragged sound of Finch's breathing on the other side of the door. This is the final turn of the screw, the final act of his psychological war. He is letting Finch stew in his own terror, trapped in his sanctuary-turned tomb. Inside, Alastair Finch is unraveling. He is backed against his desk, a pistol in one hand, a bottle of brandy in the other. He stares at the door, expecting it to burst open at any second. But the silence from the hallway is more terrifying than any assault. It is the silence of the patient predator, of the grave. The ghost is just outside, and he is not rushing. He is savoring this. The fire outside begins to die down as the livery burns itself out, but a new sound begins, the splintering crack of timbers from the roof of the mercantile next door, which has now caught fire. The flames are spreading. The fire, which Finch started to kill one man, is now threatening to consume his entire town, his entire kingdom. Finally, The waiting becomes too much. "All right, Marlowe. All right," Finch shrieks, his voice cracking. "You want a duel. You want your satisfaction. I'll give it to you. In the street. Man to man, damn you." Elias hears the desperation in Finch's voice. This is the moment he has been waiting for. Finch believes he is setting the terms, luring Elias into a public gunfight where he might have a chance. But Elias knows the truth. Finch is not setting a trap. He is fleeing one. The street. At sunrise, Elias's voice replies, as calm as a judge passing sentence. He hears Finch agree, a choked, ragged sound. Elias then turns and walks down the stairs, leaving the two unconscious guards where they lie. He has the town's justice in his duster, and he has an appointment with his own at dawn. The siege is over. The execution is set. The dawn that breaks over Border Ridge is a bruised, wounded thing. The sky is a dirty gray, haze with the smoke that still rises in a thick, lazy column from the smoldering, blackened skeleton of the livery stable. The fire is out, but the smell of ash and ruin hangs heavy in the air, a funereal incense for the death of the town's innocents. The streets are deserted. The townspeople, exhausted and terrified, remain barricaded in their homes, silent witnesses to the final act they know is coming. Elias stands in the center of the street, a solitary figure in the gray light. He did not sleep. He spent the last hours of the night in Sarah's small, quiet house. He gave her the journal. When this is over, he had told her, "Give this to the territorial marshal. It's Tom's justice. It's the town's." She had tried one last time to plead with him, to convince him to let the law handle it, but she saw in his faded blue eyes that he was beyond her reach. He was a man walking his last mile. Now, he waits. He is calm. The burning rage that has fueled him for 5 years has cooled, leaving behind a hard, cold clarity. This is no longer about rage. It is about balance. A life for a life. An end for an end. He checks his Colt peacemaker. He spins the cylinder. 5 empty chambers, and one filled with a brass-cased point for 5 cartridge. His final statement. The door to the mayor's office opens. Alistair Finch steps out onto the balcony, then descends the stairs to the street. He is no longer the polished, respectable mayor. His tailored suit is disheveled, his face is pale and slick with sweat, and his eyes are wide and wild with a mixture of fear and cornered animal fury. He holds a silver-plated revolver in his hand, a showman's gun. He walks to the center of the street until he is 30 paces from Elias. "So, the ghost has come to claim his due," Finch says, his voice a hoarse attempt at a sneer. "I've come to deliver a message," Elias replies, his voice flat. "From my brother." "Your brother was a fool," Finch spits. "He was a weak link, and he paid the price. This is a world for wolves, Marlowe, not for sheep. This is a world of consequences, Finch," Elias says. "And you've run out of places to hide from yours." The two men stand in silence, the empty town their witness. The first rays of the rising sun cut through the smoke, casting long, distorted shadows behind them. It is a classic, archetypal scene, the final duel between good and evil. But Elias feels no sense of heroism. He feels only the crushing weight of his past and the profound emptiness of his future. Finch, terrified but desperate, makes his move. He believes his only chance is to preempt the draw of the legendary serpent. His hand flashes, bringing the silver revolver up. But he is a banker playing a gunfighter's game. His motion is a clumsy, panicked jerk. Elias moves with a grace that is both beautiful and terrible to behold. His hand flows down to his hip, the worn Colt appearing in it as if by an act of will. There is no wasted motion, no hesitation. It is the culmination of a lifetime of violence, a single perfect, final act. His gun clears the holster and levels an infinitesimal fraction of a second before Finch's. A single gunshot thunders through the silent town, its echo rolling off the buildings like the crack of doom. Alistair Finch stands for a moment, a look of utter surprise on his face. A small, dark hole appears in the center of his chest. His silver revolver, and fired, clatters from his nerveless fingers into the dust. He looks at Elias, his mouth opening as if to speak, but only a soft sigh escapes. He crumples to the ground, his reign of lies and blood over. Elias stands over the body of his last enemy, the smoke from his Colt curling in the cool morning air. He has done it. The promise is fulfilled. The debt is paid. He waits for the feeling of release, of satisfaction, of peace. but nothing comes. There is only silence. The ghosts of Croft and Lefty Pete do not fade. The face of his brother does not smile down at him from the heavens. The gaping hole in his soul is not filled. He is just a man, standing in a ruined town, with an empty gun in his hand. The vengeance that had defined him, that had been his only reason for living for 5 years, is gone, and it has left nothing in its place. The gunshot, the single, final report, acts as a period at the end of a long and bloody sentence. For a moment after it fades, the silence in Border Ridge is absolute. Then, slowly, life returns. A door creaks open. A face appears in a window. The townspeople emerge from their homes, drawn by the silence as much as by the shout. They see their mayor, the great Alistair Finch, lying dead in the dust. And they see the stranger, the ghost, standing over him, his gun still smoking. They do not rush him. They do not cheer. They simply stand and watch, their faces a mixture of awe and fear, and a dawning, fragile hope. Sarah is the first to move. She walks from her house, her head held high, and stands a few feet from Elias, the journal held in her hands like a shield. Elias looks at Finch's body, then at his own gun. He raises the Colt, opens the loading gate, and slowly ejects the single-spent casing. It falls to the dust with a small, metallic tinkle. He then ejects the other 2 live rounds, the bullets he had carried for Harker and Cole. They join the casing in the dust. He now holds a completely empty gun. He looks at it, not as a weapon, but as a relic, a symbol of a life he no longer knows how to live. He has faced his enemy. He has faced his past. Now, in the quiet aftermath, he must face himself. And he finds nothing there. He is a shell, as empty as the gun in his hand. The question that has haunted him now rises to the surface. Is this all there is? Was the destruction of 3 men worth the destruction of his own soul? He looks at Sarah. He sees in her eyes not fear, but a deep, sorrowful understanding. He sees the journal in her hands, the symbol of a different kind of justice, a justice that builds instead of just destroys. He looks at the townspeople, at their tentative, hopeful faces. They are free, but they are also lost, their leader a fraud, their town built on a lie. In that moment, Elias Marlowe makes a choice. His quest for vengeance is over, but perhaps a new path is just beginning. A path of atonement. He lets the empty Colt Peacemaker fall from his hand. It lands softly in the dust, the sound barely audible. It is the sound of a man laying down his ghosts. It is the sound of a surrender, not to an enemy, but to the possibility of a future. He turns his back on the body of Alistair Finch and the life he has just ended. He looks at Sarah. The town will need a new sheriff, he says, his voice still a rasp, but with a new note in it, something other than just vengeance. A real one. He doesn't know if he will be that man. He doesn't know if he is capable of being anything other than a killer. But as he stands there, in the smoky dawn of a ruined town, with 3 empty shells lying in the dust at his feet, Elias 3 shots, Marlowe knows one thing for certain. He has fired his last bullet. And for the first time in 5 years, tomorrow is no longer just a concept. It is a destination. His war is over. His penance has just begun.